The night was supposed to end like any other, just another weary walk home after a grueling shift. But for Officer Daniel, fate had different plans. A stray dog, small and scruffy, refused to leave his side. Its desperate eyes locked onto him with an intensity he couldn't ignore. At first, he brushed it off, thinking it was just another lost pet. But then he noticed the collar, and inside it, a note. The shaky, childlike handwriting made his pulse quicken. "My sister is sick. No food, no water. Please help. Apartment 3B. In an instant, exhaustion gave way to urgency. The dog wasn't just following him, it was leading him. Somewhere out there, a child was waiting, hoping, barely holding on. With every step toward the darkened apartment complex, a dreadful weight settled in his chest. By the time he reached that locked door, Daniel knew he wasn't leaving without answers. I'm Rose, and today I have a powerful story to share with you. One of resilience, hope, and an unexpected hero. Stay with me as we uncover the chilling truth behind a simple note, a stray dog's desperate plea, and the lives that hang in the balance. The dog scratched at the door, whining. That was enough for Daniel. He stepped back, braced himself, and rammed his shoulder into the door. The flimsy wood splintered, the lock snapping under the force. How would you react if a stray dog started following you, refusing to leave your side? Would you ignore it, or would you stop to understand why? Officer Daniel had no time for distractions after an exhausting shift. His feet ached, his mind was clouded with fatigue, and all he wanted was to go home. But as he walked through the dimly lit streets, a small, scruffy dog trotted behind him. Its eyes locked onto him with an urgency he couldn't ignore. He sighed, assuming it was just another lost stray, but something about the way it moved, determined, desperate, made him hesitate. Then he saw it, a collar, and tucked inside, a crumpled piece of paper. Daniel's pulse quickened as he unfolded the note, the unsteady, childlike handwriting shaking under the flickering streetlight. "My sister is sick. No food, no water. Please help. Apartment 3B. Exhaustion vanished. Instinct took over. The dog let out a small whimper and then turned, its tail wagging anxiously as if urging him forward. Someone needed help. A child needed help. Daniel stuffed the note into his pocket, scanning the empty street. The wind carried a quiet stillness, making the moment feel heavier. The dog took a few steps ahead, then looked back at him. This wasn't just a stray. It was a messenger. His gut tightened as he followed. The neighborhood was worn down, cracked sidewalks, flickering streetlights, an apartment complex with a rusted security gate barely hanging onto its hinges. The closer he got, the worse it felt. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. He reached apartment 3B and knocked firmly. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Silence, but not the kind of silence that meant no one was home. The kind of silence that hid something. The smell hit him first. Stale air, unwashed clothes, something sour and rotten. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a small, crumbling apartment. And then he saw them. A frail boy, no older than 8, curled protectively around a tiny, unmoving girl. His heart slammed against his ribs. Jonathan. And his baby sister, Aaliyah. This wasn't just a welfare check. This was life or death. Officer Daniel had seen neglect before. He had seen hunger in the eyes of forgotten children, had walked into homes where silence spoke louder than words. But this was different. The boy, Jonathan, barely reacted as Daniel stepped closer. He was curled up against the wall, his arms wrapped around Aaliyah, shielding her as if the world itself were a threat. He wasn't just thin, he was starving. His cheeks were hollow, his skin pale, his clothes too big, hanging off him like they belonged to another child entirely. And Aaliyah, she was worse. Her tiny chest barely moved, her lips dry and cracked, her skin flushed with fever. She was dying. Daniel's pulse pounded. He had no time to waste. He lowered his voice, careful, controlled. "Hey, kid, I'm Officer Daniel. I'm here to help." Jonathan didn't move, didn't blink. He just stared at Daniel, wide-eyed, like a cornered animal. Daniel took a slow step forward. How long had they been alone? How long had this boy fought to keep his sister alive with nothing but desperation and sheer will? Jonathan flinched. His arms tightened around Aaliyah, his thin frame trembling. "Your sister needs a doctor," Daniel said gently, his heart hammering in his chest. "We have to go, okay?" Still, nothing. Daniel swallowed hard. This wasn't just fear. This was mistrust. This was a child who had been abandoned, forgotten, left to fend for himself. He had every reason not to trust another adult. So Daniel did the only thing he could. He knelt, lowering himself to Jonathan's level, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. "I promise you nothing bad will happen, but we need to move, right now." A beat of silence, a second, a third, then finally, a slow, hesitant nod. That was all Daniel needed. He reached out, carefully lifting Aaliyah into his arms. She was too light, far too light for a child her age, malnourished, weak, fragile. Jonathan clung to his sleeve as they stepped out into the night. The little dog, his messenger, ran ahead, leading the way. Daniel didn't just hear the sirens in the distance. He felt them. Because tonight, 2 lives were hanging in the balance, and he would not let them slip away. The sterile hum of hospital lights flickered overhead as Officer Daniel sat rigidly in the waiting room, his knee bouncing anxiously. His mind was racing, replaying the past hour over and over. Jonathan sat beside him, silent and stiff, his small fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Aaliyah was somewhere beyond the cold double doors, surrounded by doctors who had barely spared Daniel a glance before rushing her away. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had dealt with emergencies before, with life-or-death situations that demanded a quick response. But this was different. It wasn't just a call. It wasn't just another report. It was personal. He glanced down at Jonathan, who hadn't moved an inch. The boy's clothes still hung loosely off his frail frame, his sneakers worn down with holes in the toes. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if any sudden movement might shatter what little he had left. Daniel cleared his throat. "What's your name, kid?" A long pause. Then, barely above a whisper, "Jonathan." Daniel nodded. "And your sister?" Jonathan swallowed, his voice even quieter now. "Aaliyah." The name hung in the air like a fragile thread between them. Daniel clenched his jaw, trying to steady the anger simmering beneath his skin. No child should ever have to live like this. He softened his tone. "Where are your parents, Jonathan?" The boy's entire body tensed, his shoulders hunched inward as if bracing for an impact. A beat. Then, a whisper so soft Daniel almost didn't hear it. "They left." Daniel's hands curled into fists. Jonathan stared down at the floor, blinking fast, his breath shaky. "They said they'd come back." He hesitated. Then, in a voice so hollow, it barely sounded real. "But they never did." Daniel inhaled sharply, his heart hammering. Weeks. This boy had been alone, taking care of a sick baby, with no food, no water, just hope. Daniel leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. "You don't have to do this alone anymore, I promise." Jonathan didn't move, didn't speak, but slowly, so slowly, his fists uncurled. And for the first time in weeks, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally come to stay. The steady rhythm of the clock echoed through Officer Daniel's apartment as he stood in the doorway, watching Jonathan sit stiffly on the couch, his arms wrapped tightly around his little sister, Aaliyah. The boy's grip was protective, his wary eyes scanning the unfamiliar space, as if any sudden movement might make this temporary safety vanish. They had been through too much to trust so easily. Daniel had seen this look before, the look of a child who had learned to rely on no one but himself. It twisted something deep in his gut. Jonathan's fingers tightened in Aaliyah's blanket as he glanced around the room. It wasn't much. A small, clean apartment, a modest couch, and a tiny kitchen with dishes stacked from Daniel's rushed attempt at breakfast. Not exactly a home, but it was warm, safe, and filled with something Jonathan hadn't known in a long time: stability. Daniel cleared his throat, stepping inside. "You guys hungry?" Jonathan hesitated before giving a small nod. Daniel had expected as much. The kid was too thin, too used to going without. Food was survival to him, not comfort. He turned to the kitchen, rolling up his sleeves. "All right, I'm making pancakes." He should have known it would end in disaster. The moment the first pancake hit the pan, the smell of burning batter filled the room. The smoke alarm screeched in protest. Daniel cursed under his breath, waving a towel in front of it. Then, the most unexpected thing happened. A sound, soft, barely there, but real. A short, breathy laugh. Daniel turned. Jonathan was smiling. It was small, hesitant, but it was there. "You really suck at this," the boy muttered, shaking his head. Daniel chuckled, pretending to be offended. "Excuse me, but I happen to be a professional chef." Jonathan scoffed, pulling Aaliyah closer, but the tension in his shoulders eased. It was a tiny crack in the walls he had built, but it was a start. For the first time, Daniel didn't just see a kid trying to survive. He saw a boy who deserved to laugh again, and he was going to make sure Jonathan never had to be afraid of losing everything again. The soft hum of the apartment's heater was the only sound in the room as Officer Daniel stood by the window, staring at the darkened streets below. He had spent the past few weeks adjusting to the weight of responsibility, not just as a protector, but as something more. He wasn't sure what to call it yet. A guardian? A mentor? A father? The thought sent a strange pang through his chest, but he shook it off. Behind him, Jonathan sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring his cereal. Across from him, little Aaliyah babbled happily, tiny fists slamming against the high chair tray as she giggled at her reflection in a spoon. It was a picture of something fragile, something healing, something dangerously close to feeling like family. And then, the knock came, a sharp, deliberate knock at the door. Daniel stiffened, his instincts flaring. He turned, catching the way Jonathan froze, his entire body going rigid. The spoon clattered against the bowl, forgotten. His knuckles turned white as his small hands clenched into fists on the table. He knew who it was. Daniel took a slow breath before moving toward the door. He cracked it open just enough to see a woman standing on the other side, disheveled, hollow-eyed, unsteady. "Where are my kids?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "I came back for them." Jonathan didn't move, but the way his face emptied of all emotion told Daniel everything he needed to know. Daniel stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him. He studied the woman, her bloodshot eyes, trembling hands, the scent of alcohol lingering in the air. A mother who had left her children starving in an abandoned apartment. "You left them," Daniel said, his voice calm but unyielding. "For weeks. No food, No water. Tears welled in her eyes. I was trying to fix things, she whispered. I didn't mean to. You weren't coming back. The words didn't come from Daniel. They came from Jonathan. His voice was quiet but strong, and in that moment, Daniel knew. Jonathan had already made his choice. Here's the big takeaway. Family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who stand by you, no matter what. It's about the unbreakable bonds we create with those who truly care. Family is not always defined by blood, but by the people who choose to stand by us, protect us, and never abandon us. Officer Daniel never planned to take in Jonathan and Aliyah, yet when faced with their suffering, he didn't turn away. He stepped up. His choice to care, to fight for them, and to love them unconditionally proved that true family is built on trust, commitment, and selfless actions. Jonathan, after enduring so much loss, learned that not all promises are empty, that some people stay. This story teaches us that sometimes the greatest love comes from unexpected places. It reminds us that doing what is right isn't always easy, but it can change lives forever. In a world where too many people walk away, choosing to stay, to protect, and to love is the most powerful act of all. Family is not given, it is made.